Hey, what's up YouTube? Welcome to today's video, and I decided to make a little bit of a Diablo 4 video just because today is the open beta. So if you haven't tried out Diablo 4, go try it out today. Now I know in the past videos I've been pretty positive and optimistic about Diablo 4. I do think it is going to be a great game for the ARPG genre, and it will introduce a lot of fans to the ARPG genre. However, for hardcore veterans who've played a lot of ARPGs, I do feel like one aspect of Diablo 4 is probably going to lead to a lot of criticism that a lot of people are going to be throwing at Blizzard. And this is the most worrying part about Diablo 4, and it's one of the things that makes me kind of scared about the end game. But the one thing that is commonly mentioned throughout the beta is how bad the dungeon designs are and how boring the dungeons are to play after you've done them a few times. And some of the dungeon objectives are actually objectively not fun to do. There's a lot of backtracking. So this is the question that an interviewer made to, I think, the game director or game developer. So this is one other bit of feedback I saw, and this came from a few people. And there's not a few people, it's actually a lot of people who had this opinion, was they're not being overly enamored with dungeon design. That just seemed to be that the dungeons were too big and involved backtracking to grab keys and unlock doors and so on. Is this something you've seen, and are you taking a look at it? Now, this is something that I definitely noticed while doing the beta. I did do almost all of the dungeons in the beta, and I did feel like the dungeons were kind of long. There weren't that many mobs. There were a lot of annoying objectives to do, and I was backtracking a lot after activating the levers to go back. And it was kind of a really unfun experience after a little bit, but it kind of was balanced out by the fact the game was so new and I was actually having a lot of fun with the combat. So if we actually look over here and what he says, so yada yada yada. So if we go over here, where does he even talk about the dungeon? So right here, Joe Shelley is the name. We've seen it. There's a few elements there. There's some players who we've added the ability to teleport out of the dungeons via the UI. So this person's like trying to say that the backtracking is because we don't know how to teleport out of the dungeon, but that's not really what most people are complaining about. And then it says we don't want players to be running through an empty dungeon in case we're going to get a key and running back through the area. There should be enemies that are showing up to refresh that. So maybe they're going to change it up a little bit. They're going to add some mobs that respawn when you backtrack. And then they go over, but when you think about dungeons overall, there are well over 100 dungeons in the game. And in the beta, of course, you're only seeing dungeons that exist in the Fracture Peaks. So they're pretty much saying there's not that many layouts and tile sets, so we don't really need to worry about it because the dungeons that we see in the beta are a tiny amount of the total amount of dungeons. And lastly, they mention, I want to do each of these dungeons. So we're going to be able to do all these dungeons, and we'll understand why we need to do these dungeons once we understand the Codex of Power and the whole system for the end game. So basically, they're saying that the dungeons in the beta are not really representative of what we're going to be playing at the end game. Now, this is one of the biggest issues because I do think that for the majority of players, we will be in dungeons for the majority of our endgame experience. And right now, the core endgame revolves around running nightmare dungeons, and you're progressing through the 100 tiers of the nightmare dungeons to get better and better loot. Now, the dungeons just feel very tedious and repetitive because of these objectives. We're going to go over what objectives there actually are. But currently, Diablo 4's dungeon system is that there's 150 dungeons around the world in the open world of Sanctuary. You can see this is I think there was 23 total in Fracture Peak. So the game developer is right in the sense that there's only a tiny amount of dungeons that were available in the beta. And they're randomized with multiple connecting tile sets. And when you finish the dungeon, you gain a certain amount of renown, which is applied to finishing up the zone completion and getting more Paragon points. So we pretty much have to do every single dungeon in the game because every single dungeon gives you an aspect or a legendary power that you can put on a rare. So that is their incentive of you having to do all of the dungeons one time. Now, nightmare dungeons are the whole end game, and these are end game variants of the dungeons with stronger monsters, new objectives, and other afflictions. So you could think of afflictions like in Path of Exile with monster haste or monster damage or minus max or something like that. And that is what the whole end game is going to be about. It's going to be doing these set of dungeons, trying to progress the tier as high as possible, and dealing with the new objectives and afflictions that we are forced to fight. So what are these dungeon objectives that are actually so bad? So most of these dungeon objectives and dungeons are super, super annoying to do in the long run after you have your first experience of the dungeon. Every single dungeon is going to be fun one time or two times, especially when you haven't done it before, you haven't seen the tile set before. However, the replayability is going to be pretty hard to convince people to do objectives like defeat all enemies in the area, activate all the levers. So in this case, one lever could be over here, one lever could be all the way over there, and then you have to go press the gate to get over somewhere. And then this is the randomly generated layouts supposedly that they were using. And you can see over here, they're pretty much all the same layouts. These are the start of the dungeon and what the dungeon actually looks like. And 9 runs in a row, this guy got a layout that was pretty much identical. A lot of people say that this is due to the lack of tile sets. However, if you actually look at what people say, so this is actually the Reddit from where I found this article from, and there's a lot of people who say, I have played the endgame beta, and in the endgame beta, they actually had access to all of the tile sets, or most of the worlds. They have almost all of the world done, and they were doing the nightmare dungeons, and most of the people said the nightmare dungeons felt identical to the normal dungeons, and the dungeon layout was just as bad as ever. There was no real variations in it, and that's just people's experience from the closed beta of the end game. I've also seen footage of the dungeons in the late game, and it does look like it's more or less all the same. Now, I do think that backtracking is probably one of the biggest problems. It never feels good going back and walking through the map. It just feels like you're wasting a lot of your time. And a lot of the dungeon layouts are actually super, super long and narrow corridors. It's not like you're walking a short amount of time. It is actually a very, very long walk. And they do say they're going to add some mobs to kill when you backtrack, but it remains to be seen how they actually implement it. And some of these objectives are just horrendous. Like, defeating every single enemy should not exist. It should be like defeat 90%, kind of like the greater rifts in Diablo 3. And some of these, like, free the prisoners and then like find and destroy constructs is okay actually, but some of these ones, they have you like freeing 6 prisoners, activating gate controls with levers on opposite sides. And I like defeating the boss is good, and I do think that some of the events are pretty cool in the dungeon, but overall, you can't really be boss rushing in these maps. You have to do the objectives. It's a very, very linear experience. You don't really feel like you have any player agency. You can't just run to the boss and kill it. You have to do these objectives. And I do feel like after you do each of these dungeons once, you are going to probably hate your experience after a while. And as I said, Blizzard did respond in an interview, and they responded by pretty much saying that the dungeons have the same layout because we only have access to the first zone. And one interesting thing they mentioned is that Diablo 4's dungeons are not just about slaying demons. It's not slaying dungeons, it's slaying demons. So it's not all about just killing monsters. They want you to have that experience of doing these objectives, and doing each varied objective does set the dungeon apart from each other, right? So that's actually one of the biggest things they mentioned. And they did mention they want to fix backtracking. Now, as I said before, the problem is there was a closed beta endgame test. And in that test, most of the beta testers said that all of the dungeon layouts were the same. The mob density was not really that great. And it was an issue that was brought up over and over again. I think the 2 biggest things that the closed beta endgame testers brought up was that itemization and dungeons need to work. But it remains to be seen if Blizzard can actually take that feedback into account and try to fix the issue before Season 1 launches. Now, I don't really know what they can do to make the dungeons feel less repetitive. A lot of the people who are game developers and who work in the game industry say that it's really, really hard for them to, to make it less repetitive and make it more procedural because they lack the amount of tile sets. So if you think about Path of Exile has so many different tile sets and so many maps that they have built up over time, especially from the varied campaigns. So this might just be a wait and see thing where Diablo 4 just needs a little bit of time, and then they can finally change up the dungeons after launch. I think at this point, especially with the current state of the beta, it might be really unrealistic for players to expect the dungeons to suddenly get magically better by launch, because there's only, I think, around 3 months. And I do think that some of the dungeon objectives can be reworked a little bit, especially to kill all the enemies. And I think that's a pretty easy fix. But I'm not really sure exactly when Season 1 comes out. I think Season 1 is rumored to be coming out in September. So they do have around like 3 months or so to get things right. And I do think that once the launch hype wears off and people actually start playing the end game, one of the biggest things that people will complain about is the fact that the dungeons feel unfun, the forced objectives feel unfun, the backtracking feels unfun, and the repetitive nature of the layouts of the dungeons will feel unfun. Because I know even in just my short experience on the beta, I could definitely pinpoint that the dungeons were not going to be as fun after I do a few of them. But in the end, I do think that overall D4 is in a great spot. It will get a lot of players. Its combat feels good. And this is pretty much more of an end game thing that people will realize once they step into the dungeons. And I honestly do not know how much of a difference Nightmare dungeons will be compared to regular dungeons, because you're literally just adding an affliction or so. So you can just think of a Path of Exile map with like additional mod or two. But we may be surprised. I mean, the beta might just be a really early build compared to what they are working with currently. And maybe the launch might just have the best dungeon and best map generation and best level design ever. And the objectives will be completely overhauled. I don't know. But let's hope for the best. I hope you find more mirrors and divines than me. And let me know down in the comments below if you enjoyed doing the dungeons after you did like 20 or 30 of them. Actually, only reply if you did around 50 dungeons in the beta. But thanks for watching, everyone. Go check out the open beta and see you next time. Bye!